So I don't know if you watched recently, like you had like the great Kirk Franklin, gospel singer, that was criticized for abusive language that he said to his son. And I was thinking to myself, I was like, wow, that's pretty much how I grew up.
Pretty tame compared to like what would happen, yeah. And his son is 30.
What's up, young scholars? This the dad Cypher.
What up, young scholars? This your boy, the excellent Lawrence Professor, and you are watching an episode of the Chop Up, where we talk to everyday fathers and we talk about issues that deal with fatherhood. And because many of us don't get a chance to give our narrative, everyone else is giving our narrative for us. So sitting to my left is Portland's finest, Mr. Damian Bunting of the Security Guard channel. Welcome to the show, my man.
Hey, I really appreciate you having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So right now, what was your father's experience like?
I'm just going to be very open and honest here because, hopefully this can help some people, okay?
All right.
So my father was a great father. He was there. He worked his ass off, probably more than he should have. So he grew up under Jim Crow segregation. He grew up under school segregation. That whole image of the Little Rock Nine, when you see the black teenagers going into Central High School and people throwing things and the dogs being sicked on them, that's 10 minutes from where my dad grew up. So I grew up in a situation where my dad finally had the means, and in the state of Arkansas, we were finally allowed, because they allowed us, to move into a suburban area. He provided for us, looking back and understanding, like from a perspective of understanding what he was making when I was a kid, the lifestyle that he gave us. It blows my mind what he was able to accomplish, knowing what he was making and how many hours he worked. Like the fact that it goes without saying that it's amazing what he did. Okay. It was a very enjoyable childhood in one regard, but on the other hand, there was a lot of pain associated with it because I've said this openly, and this has been a rift between my father and I. My father was very abusive. Most people cannot see ambiguity and nuance, right? And I think that there was a time period over the past, maybe say, 10 years, where I didn't understand why. Like in my opinion, there was no reason and there was no justification for him to have been so abusive. But as I've gotten older, and now, my kids are teenagers and young adults, I understand that what my dad was trying to do is he was trying to put a level of fear in me that would keep me from making mistakes that would have led to my death. And in Arkansas in the 80s and the early 90s, the missteps and the mistakes that I could have made as a young black man, it legitimately, this is not a figure of speech, it legitimately could have led to my death. So although there are repercussions and ramifications for how my dad handled me, and I can see that and say that was abusive, on the other hand, I can also look at that and 110% understand. Now, that being said, the conversations with my dad, you have to remember that he was spanking us all the time for everything. Now, as a parent, when my dad looks back, he's like, well, it wasn't that bad. I didn't spank you as bad as my dad spanked me. Well, you only have to go back 3.5 generations in my family before you hit slavery. So if you take those 3 generations of how my great-great-grandfather disciplined my great-grandfather beat my grandfather so bad at the age of 12 because they had 8 or 9 kids living in a 1-bedroom shack, right?
Wow.
They were so hungry because apparently, this is a story that I love that I know this history. Apparently, every Sunday they would cook a chicken. They would kill a chicken, cook a chicken, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this chicken, my great grandfather would get the biggest piece of chicken, and it would just get quartered out, right?
Right.
On this one particular Sunday, the preacher came over and ate damn near all the chicken.
Oh, hell
So
no.
my grandfather, being 12 years old, didn't get anything to eat and was starving. They go to bed. He wakes up, sneaks out to the garden, and digs up an onion, a raw onion, and eats an onion. His dad comes into the bedroom early in the morning the next day, and is like, who was out in the garden digging up my vegetables? Nobody wants to admit it. He makes everybody breathe into his face so he can smell who ate the onion. And my grandfather had eaten the onion. Okay. His dad beat him, like literally beat him up so bad that he ran away from home and joined the railroad at 12 years old.
Wow.
So this is like the early 1920s. And I can't even imagine. My dad tells me stories about my grandpa working on the railroad, and, he's run away from his dad, and now he's around grown men who are sharks. And my grandpa gets his first check and they beat him up and take it. He gets his next check, they beat him up and take it. You know what I mean? It would not surprise me one bit if there's bodies somewhere that my grandpa has killed somebody, because that's the life that he was in. So I paint that picture to say this. The society of Black men is 180 degrees different from my dad's and your dad's generation. We didn't talk about, our parents didn't talk about depression. They didn't talk about post-traumatic stress. They didn't talk about emotions. You know what I mean? It was just, I got to feed my family. I got to pay my rent. I got to keep my kids alive. And if that means I got to beat the shit out of somebody because they're out of line, then so be it. Now, you and me, we're in a different society. That's not even acceptable to say nowadays. Right. Let alone do it. So when I try to have this conversation with my father, he cannot get past the fact that I would even remotely look at him and say, you were abusive. Because to him, he's thinking I was only doing what I knew to do to protect you because I loved you with all my heart. My dad is now disciplining me and raising me as a young kid. At the same time, my dad is constantly in situations of imagery on television or things in music. The 80s was all about androgynous and the gender bending. You know what I mean? Right. And I distinctly remember my dad saying things like, don't grow up to be a faggot. Don't grow up to be sweet. Don't grow up to do this. So I'm painting a picture. I'm going to wrap this up. When I was 7 years old, I was molested. And I couldn't tell my father because I was terrified that he was going to equate that with me being gay and that was going to lead to me getting a beating. So until I was 37 years old, I never said anything. Wow. My mom was involved in the situation with where she took me. My mom had just died. And I shared this information with my dad. And I prefaced it with, I was afraid to tell you this because I thought you were going to disown me. Wow. That conversation led to me and my dad not talking for 6 months. He basically proved me right because he couldn't deal with the conversation of, this is how I felt and how I saw it at 7 years old. So he and other people in my family have taken that revelation as me putting my dad on blast and speaking ill or negatively about him. And it's led to so many problems in my situation with my immediate family.
How do you think that shaped who you are as a dad?
I think that it's come full circle. So, you know, when I got divorced from my ex-wife, my son was almost 10. And my youngest daughter had just been born. So she was born in June. We got legally separated by that October, and we were divorced by that following February. So you're talking about, you know, 13 years of me not being in the household with my kids. But you asked me how that has affected me as a father. I couldn't have, and even to this day, it is a literal daily struggle for me to have a normal, positive relationship with sex. I have an insatiable appetite for sex. And it's so skewed because I don't have an upbringing of a normal relationship. My mom cheated on my dad in my face. My dad cheated on my mom in my face. So I get married at 19, have my first kid at 19, and by the grace of God, was pretty good. I never cheated on my wife for 10 whole years of marriage. But as I started to hit 30 and have that first midlife crisis, my mom is terminally ill. She's on her deathbed. I'm losing my first business. I'm starting to doubt myself as a man. And all it takes, whether we're talking about for COVID to take your life, or for cancer to sneak in, or for you to lose your finances, or for you to make a mistake sexually, is for you to be in a position of weakness and vulnerability. And I did that. I had an affair. I ended up losing my family over that affair. I lost my businesses over that affair. I went into bankruptcy, and I accept and I own all that. But it wasn't until damn near 5 years ago, we're talking very recently in my life, where I started to kind of like sit down and evaluate all of the things that have happened in my life and go, okay, either one, I'm just a bad person and I continue to make mistakes, or two, maybe there's some things I need to try and unravel. It's like a ball of Christmas lights. If I can unravel this ball of Christmas lights, the ultimate thing that I want, and I've told this to my kids, I just want my kids to stop the cycle.